popular kid's secret kiss had a secret of its own. No, you're doing it all wrong. You're butchering the language. Juan's voice was soft, but there was a hint of exasperation as he shook his head. He leaned closer, his black hair falling into his face, and pointed at the page in my notebook. His golden eyes practically glowed under the dim light of his desk lamp. I laughed nervously, rubbing the back of my neck. Well, I'm not fluent in rolling my R's. It's not exactly my thing. He sighed dramatically, but his lips twitched like he was trying not to smile. It's not that hard, Scott. Try again. Pedal. Pura. I stopped, fumbling over the word. Not pura, it's pedal, he said, his accent making the words sound smooth and, okay, way hotter than it had any right to be. I tried again. Puro. Juan broke into a laugh. An actual laugh, not one of those polite chuckles he usually gave people at school. It was low and warm, and it made my chest tighten. Better, he said, shaking his head, but we're going to need a lot more practice. Yeah, well, I said, leaning back in my chair, you're the genius. I'm just here to soak it all in. Juan gave me this look, kind of shy, kind of amused, and I felt my face heat up. It was crazy how someone could be so quiet all the time and still hold so much, I don't know, power? Like when Juan talked to me, it felt like the world slowed down a little, like he was letting me in on some secret no one else got to know. His golden eyes flickered back to my notebook. Let's try something easier. How about, me llamo Scott? Can you handle that? I grinned. You think I can't handle that? Watch this. Me llamo Scott, I said, throwing in an exaggerated roll of the R just to make him laugh again. It worked. He laughed, shaking his head at me like I was hopeless. But the way his smile softened when he looked at me, yeah. I'd butcher every Spanish word in the dictionary if it meant seeing that look again. So I guess this means you like me now, huh? I teased, trying to keep it light. Juan just rolled his eyes, but his cheeks went a little pink. And I knew, at that moment, I was totally screwed. Flashback. 5 months ago. My legs felt like jelly after all those drills, but I was finally heading out when... BAM! I collided with something solid. Like, really solid. It actually hurt. Hey, watch where you're... I started, ready to chew the guy out, but then I saw him. Those eyes. Golden. Like actual sunlight trapped in them. They were wide, startled, and maybe a little guilty. Like he hadn't meant to bump into me. His face was... soft, I guess? Innocent, with sharp cheekbones and black hair that fell messily around his face. He mumbled something I barely caught. Sorry. His voice so quiet I almost thought I imagined it. He glanced at me again, his eyes flickering nervously like he was worried I'd yell at him. Then he ducked his head and stepped around me, walking away without another word. I just stood there, watching him disappear down the hall. Who was that guy? I'd never seen him around before, and trust me, I would have noticed. Scott, you coming? Someone from the team called out behind me. Yeah, I muttered, still staring after the guy. It was weird. I couldn't shake this feeling like the air around me had changed for a second. Like he'd left something behind, even though he was already gone. I finally started walking, shaking my head at myself. Pull it together, man. But I knew, deep down, I wasn't going to forget those golden eyes anytime soon. About an hour later, I was halfway to zoning out in Spanish class when the teacher clapped her hands for attention. Class, we have a new student joining us today, she said. Everyone, please welcome Juan Ignacio. My head snapped up at the name, and sure enough, he walked in. The guy from the hallway. He stood at the front of the room, hands stuffed in his pockets, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. His hair was still a mess, falling into his golden eyes, and he didn't smile or anything. Just gave a small nod as the teacher introduced him. Take the empty seat next to Scott, she said, gesturing toward me. I straightened up as he walked toward the desk beside mine. His steps were quiet, like he was trying not to draw attention. When he sat down, he didn't even look at me. Just pulled out a notebook and started doodling like nobody else in the room existed. I tried to focus on the lesson, but my eyes kept drifting to him. Juan Ignacio. Even his name sounded cool and mysterious. He was so... different. While the rest of us sat there slouching or passing notes, he sat perfectly straight, his head bent low over his notebook. I could see little sketches taking shape on the page. Trees, animals, stuff like that. They were good too. Like, way better than anything I could do. He didn't talk to anyone. Didn't seem nervous either. Just quiet. Calm. Like he didn't care if anyone noticed him. But I noticed him. A lot. It wasn't just the way he looked, although, yeah, he was ridiculously good-looking. It was the way he carried himself, like he had his own world going on in his head and didn't need anyone else in it. I couldn't figure him out, and for some reason, that made me want to try. 2 months later, I knew I'd bombed the Spanish test before the teacher even handed it back. But when Mrs. Ramirez plopped it face down on my desk, her glare was enough to confirm it. "Senor Scott," she said, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "You've outdone yourself. Again." A few kids snickered, and I slouched in my seat, feeling heat creep up my neck. "Care to share what este verbo means?" she asked, tapping the word hablar on the whiteboard like it was supposed to jog my memory. I muttered something that sounded vaguely like to eat, which, surprise, wasn't even close. More laughs from the class. Great. Just great. Mrs. Ramirez sighed, pinching the bridge of her nose. "Clearly, we need a different approach with you, Scott." She scanned the room, her eyes landing on someone behind me. "Juan, since you're our top student, would you be willing to tutor Mr. Scott here after school?" My head whipped around so fast I nearly gave myself whiplash. Juan blinked, looking startled, but then he nodded, his voice quiet as ever. "I can do that." "Perfect," Mrs. Ramirez said, like she just solved world hunger. "Maybe some of your brilliance will rub off on him." The bell rang, and I barely waited for everyone to file out before I turned to Juan. He was shoving his notebook into his bag, totally calm like this wasn't a big deal. "So, thanks for helping me," I said, trying to sound casual even though my heart was doing cartwheels. Juan looked up, his golden eyes meeting mine for a split second before he nodded again. "It's no problem." No problem? It was a huge deal for me. I mean, yeah, I'd failed the test and that sucked, but now I had an excuse to spend time with them. Just us. For once, I was actually happy about screwing up. "Cool," I said, grinning like an idiot as we walked out of the room. "Guess I'll see you after practice?" He gave a small smile and nodded again, and suddenly failing Spanish didn't seem so bad after all. 3 months later. You don't have to write everything down, you know. Juan's voice was soft but firm as he glanced at the notebook I'd been scribbling in for the past hour. We were sitting in his living room, books and papers spread out across the coffee table. "I'm a visual learner," I said, half joking. Juan raised an eyebrow, not buying it. "You're just avoiding saying it out loud." Okay, he wasn't wrong. Pronouncing Spanish words in front of him felt weird. Like I'd trip over my tongue and embarrass myself. He leaned closer, pointing to a phrase on the page. "Say this one. Me gusta jugar el fútbol." "I like to play football," I translated quickly. At least I was good at that part. "Now say it in Spanish," he prompted, his golden eyes flicking to mine. I took a breath. "Me gusta jugar al fútbol?" He chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Oh, it's not jugar, it's jugar," he said the word, rolling his R's effortlessly, and yeah, it was ridiculously attractive. I tried again. "Me gusta jugar al fútbol." His lips twitched into a small smile. "Better, you're getting it." The way he looked at me, patient, warm, made my chest feel tight. Every time we met for tutoring, I learned more than just Spanish. I learned how his eyes lit up when he explained something, how his voice softened when he laughed, how he seemed to forget the rest of the world existed when we talked. And I couldn't help it. I wanted to be the reason he smiled like that more often. "Thanks," I said, my voice a little quieter than usual. Juan just nodded, his smile lingering as he turned back to the textbook, and I sat there, trying not to think about how badly I wanted to reach across the table and keep that smile on his face forever. 2 weeks later. It was late, way past when we usually wrapped up. I was sitting on Juan's couch, flipping through one of his sketchbooks while he explained verb conjugations. "This is amazing," I said, holding up the sketch of a wolf he'd drawn. Juan glanced up, his cheeks turning pink. "It's nothing." "Are you kidding? This looks like it belongs in a museum or something." He shrugged, avoiding my eyes. "I just draw for fun. It's not a big deal." "It is," I said, meaning it. "You're really talented." For a moment he didn't say anything, just stared at the sketchbook in my hands. Then he leaned back, his golden eyes softer than usual. "Thanks," he murmured. That was the thing about Juan. He didn't talk much, but when he did, it felt important. Like he was letting me in on the part of himself no one else got to see. We didn't go back to Spanish after that. Instead, we talked. About his family in Spain, his favorite books, the music he listened to when he sketched. Every word made me feel like I was peeling back another layer, getting closer to the real him. At some point I realized he was looking at me differently. Like he was trying to figure me out too. "You're not what I expected," he said suddenly. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? I teased. He smiled, smiling a little shy. A good thing. And just like that, I was a goner. Because when Juan Ignacio looked at me like that, like I was someone worth knowing, I knew there was no going back. Flashback ends. About a month later, I stared at the Spanish test on my desk, my heart pounding like it always did when Mrs. Ramirez handed it back. Usually I dreaded these moments because I knew what was coming. Red marks, disappointment, and that little speech about taking my education seriously. But today felt different. When Mrs. Ramirez slid the paper onto my desk, her lips twitched into something resembling a smile. Nice work, Senor Scott. I blinked, flipping it over. An 85. 85. I wasn't at the top of the class or anything. Juan still had that title locked down. But this was the best I'd ever done on one of her tests. I could practically hear the imaginary crowd in my head cheering. Not bad, I muttered to myself, grinning like an idiot. Mrs. Ramirez moved on, and I heard a quiet chuckle from the desk behind me. Turning slightly, I caught Juan's golden eyes watching me, the corner of his mouth tugging up in a small, amused smile. The class felt like it dragged on forever after that. When the bell finally rang, I bolted out of my seat, clutching the test like it was a golden ticket. I didn't even make it far down the hall before Juan caught up to me. Congrats, he said, his voice soft but warm. Thanks, I said, feeling my cheeks heat up a little. He glanced at the test in my hand. You did well. Yeah, well, I said, trying to sound casual but failing miserably. I had a good teacher. Juan's smile widened. Just a little, but was enough to make my heart skip. You did the work, he said, shrugging like it wasn't a big deal. It was a big deal. Still, I said, looking at him a little longer than I probably should have. Thanks, Juan, for, everything. For a second, I thought he might say something else, but he just nodded, his gaze steady and soft. And as we walked down the hall together, I couldn't stop grinning, not even for a second. A week later, the game wasn't even a real one, just practice. But for the first time ever, I couldn't focus. I knew Juan was there. I could feel his eyes on me from the bleachers, even when I wasn't looking. It was impossible not to. Every time I glanced over, there he was, quiet, still watching. His golden eyes seemed to follow my every move, and it threw me off so badly that I almost tripped during a drill. Twice. Malcolm, what's your problem today? Coach barked at me. Nothing, Coach, I called back, shaking it off. Except it wasn't nothing. My head was a mess, my heart pounding way too hard every time I caught Juan looking at me. I told myself to get it together, but it didn't work. By the end of practice, I was so distracted I barely noticed the team heading for the locker room without me. When I finally dragged myself off the field, Juan was still there, waiting at the bottom of the bleachers. Hey, I said, trying not to sound as nervous as I felt. Hey, he said softly, his voice carrying just enough for me to hear. We stood there for a moment, the silence stretching, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It felt charged somehow. You were off today, he said, his head tilted slightly like he was trying to figure me out. I laughed, rubbing the back of my neck. Yeah, well, someone was distracting me. Juan's eyes widened slightly, his cheeks tinting pink. He opened his mouth to say something, but no words came out. Without really thinking, I took a step closer. My pulse was racing, and I could barely breathe as I looked at him. His face was so close, his golden eyes searching mine like he was waiting for me to make the next move. So I did. I leaned in, just enough for our lips to touch. It was barely a second, just a brush, but it was like fireworks. Every nerve in my body lit up. Then suddenly, Scott, let's go! Someone yelled from the parking lot. We sprang apart, my heart dropping like a rock. I started, but Juan just nodded, his face unreadable. I wanted to stay. I wanted to ask him if he felt it too, if it meant something, but I didn't get the chance. Someone grabbed my shoulder, dragging me away, and before I knew it, I was gone. 3 days later, I couldn't stop thinking about the kiss. It was all I saw when I closed my eyes. All I heard in the quiet moments between conversations or during practice. The way Juan's lips had barely touched mine but left me completely wrecked. The way my heart had practically burst out of my chest. I wanted to know if he'd felt the same, if it had been as electric for him as it was for me. And tonight, the bonfire, I was finally going to find out. The bonfire was a big deal for the team. This tradition we did every year before the season really kicked off. It was loud, chaotic, and full of energy, but I wasn't there for the team tonight. I was there for Juan. He had agreed to come after a lot of convincing. Only for a little while, he'd said. That quiet, serious look in his golden eyes made me swear up and down that I wouldn't make him stay longer than he wanted. The fire was already roaring when I got there, surrounded by the team and a few other friends laughing and passing around snacks. I scanned the crowd, my heart skipping when I spotted him. Juan stood on the edge of the clearing, leaning against a tree like he was trying to blend into the shadows. His black hair caught the firelight, and for a second, I forgot how to breathe. I made my way over, trying not to look eager. "You made it," he nodded, his lips tugging into the faintest smile. "You said it was important." It was. More than he knew. We chatted for a bit, mostly me rambling about random stuff while he listened, his eyes flicking to the fire, the crowd, and then back to me. But something about him seemed off. He kept glancing at the sky, his jaw tight, like he was waiting for something. "Hey, you okay?" I asked, leaning closer so only he could hear. "I'm fine," he said quickly. Too quickly. Before I could push further, someone called my name, dragging me into the chaos of the party. When I turned back, Juan was gone. Panic bubbled in my chest. I wandered through the crowd, asking if anyone had seen him, but they all just shrugged or shook their heads. The firelight felt too bright, the noise too loud. I slipped away from the group, heading into the woods where the darkness wrapped around me like a blanket. "Juan?" I called, my voice echoing through the trees. No answer. I walked deeper, my footsteps crunching against the dry leaves. The further I went, the quieter everything got, until the only sound was my breathing. And then I heard it. A low, guttural sound, halfway between a growl and a groan. It sent chills racing down my spine. I followed the noise, my heart pounding harder with every step. When I stepped into the clearing, I froze. Juan was there, crouched on all fours, but he wasn't right. His body was twisting unnaturally, his spine arcing as bones cracked and shifted beneath his skin. His hands, no, his paws, dug into the dirt, claws tearing at the ground. Fur was sprouting along his arms and back, black as the night around us. He threw his head back, a strangled howl ripping from his throat as his face elongated, his jaws stretching into a muzzle. "Juan?" I whispered, my voice shaking. His head snapped toward me, his glowing golden eyes locking onto mine. Recognition flickered for a brief second, and then it was gone, replaced by something wild. Something animal. I stumbled back, my foot catching on a twig. It snapped loudly, and the sound felt like a gunshot in the stillness. The creature, Juan, snarled, the deep, guttural sound reverberating in my chest. He took a step toward me, his movements jerky but powerful, like he was still figuring out his new body. "Juan," I said again, more desperate this time. "It's me, Scott!" For a moment he hesitated. His glowing eyes softened, and I hoped, that maybe, just maybe, he'd recognize me. But then he growled low, his ears flattening, and before I could say or do anything, he turned and disappeared into the trees, his massive frame blending into the shadows. I stood there, frozen, my heart racing so hard it hurt. What had I just seen? Who or what was Juan? I didn't move for what felt like forever, staring at the spot where he'd vanished. My brain was scrambling for answers, but none of it made sense. Eventually, the distant sound of laughter and music from the bonfire reminded me I wasn't alone in the woods. I turned, my legs shaky as I made my way back. The party was still in full swing when I returned, but it felt like another world entirely. I couldn't focus on anything anyone was saying, my mind spinning with questions I didn't know how to ask. All I knew was that the boy I thought I was falling for wasn't who I thought he was. And now, I wasn't sure if I'd ever see him again. To be continued. Thanks for watching. Consider subscribing to become part of our Rainbow Force and stay wholesome.